let's talk about planning our days and that sneaky thought that so many of our brains love to offer, which is something like, my schedule is just so unpredictable for planning. I'm going to just fit this thing in where I can, or I'm just going to figure it out. I know it'll fit somewhere. I don't have time to try and figure out how it'll fit. Let's be honest. This is such an alluring thought at times. It might sneak in when it comes to work projects that fall in that important but not urgent category, right? The ones that don't have that really clear deadline. Or I know for myself, it tends to sneak in more often when I think about trying to plan non-work activities into my schedule. So things like reading or crocheting or resting, catching up with friends, stuff I genuinely want to do, stuff I genuinely enjoy. But somehow when I look back on my week, even though I told myself I'm going to fit it in, the things aren't happening. And as I mentioned, I don't think I'm alone in this. So many of us rely on this idea that we're going to find the time for those things that really matter. But let's be honest, how often does that actually happen? Finding the time or squeezing it in? If you're like me, the answer is basically never. And that's what we're talking about in episode 294 of the I'm Busy Being Awesome podcast. The shift from trying to quote unquote fit things in to intentionally making space for the priorities in your life and why this one shift changes everything. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. How are you? Today, we are talking about this idea of trying to fit things in to our busy days versus intentionally creating space for our top priorities. And this topic was inspired by a group coaching call that I had just the other day. And one of my clients mentioned how impactful this difference of shifting from squeezing things in to intentionally carving out time for a few specific things, how impactful this has been for her. And I couldn't agree more. So many of us fall into that trap of believing that we can just squeeze things in at some point in the day. And while this might be true at times, in fact, I think it can be useful at times to rely on that strategy. I've also found that by and large, we usually get to the end of the day and we're feeling exhausted, worn out. We're wondering where on earth the time went and why the things that we actually care about never quite make the cut. Why do they keep getting pushed to the back burner? So let's talk about that. Why does this happen? Why do we keep convincing ourselves that we're going to, quote unquote, fit it in only to realize that we don't? And then most importantly, how can we shift from that? How can we shift from squeezing things in or trying to squeeze things in toward intentionally creating more space for those things that truly matter to us this season? All right. So let's start by exploring the first question, which is why do we tell ourselves we can find the time, we can fit it in, despite the fact that previous experience shows we usually don't, that it usually doesn't happen this way? Well, let's look at the situation through a lens of curiosity, as always. Okay, there's no judgment allowed as we build awareness here. It's not because of some personal failing. It's not because we're lazy or we're undisciplined. In fact, when we think about the ADHD brain and we think about this scenario through the lens of having ADHD, it makes a lot of sense. All right. So first and foremost, I think there's a component of flexibility. A lot of us have a very complicated relationship with structure and really strict levels of structure. We know we want some level of structure, but many of us also resist it. For a lot of us, too much structure can feel incredibly restrictive. And when we're up against it, our resistance can kick in and it feels super hard to get started because we feel like we've been boxed into this really rigid plan. So instead of deciding ahead of time when we want to do something, we think to ourselves, I can't handle that. I'm just going to do it when the time feels right. My schedule's too busy. My schedule's too unpredictable. I can't fit it in. But again, when we try to do the things when the time feels right, when we try and squeeze it in, most often those things that we want to do don't happen because the more urgent things tend to fall into place instead. All right. Number 2, time blindness. So as we know, ADHD and time blindness go hand in hand. For so many of us, we tend to assume there's going to be open space somewhere. Surely I'll be able to fit it in somewhere in the day and I can just pop in and do the thing I want to do. But again, the reality is that free time doesn't just appear, especially as adults, right? That free time tends to get taken up by whatever is sitting right in front of us. Scrolling our phone, answering emails, last minute requests, auto advance on Netflix, right? And it jumps to the next episode. And suddenly the entire day is gone. Okay, so that time blindness is a very real obstacle. Number 3 is that most of us tend to prioritize urgency. Again, that's how the ADHD brain is wired. We tend to prioritize the urgent things. If something isn't urgent for an ADHD brain, it's way too easy for the thing to get bumped because as we talk about, time seems to be either now or not now. And the things that we genuinely want to do, the hobbies that we want to explore, resting, personal projects, connecting with people, these things usually aren't screaming for our attention with the highest of high priorities, so they get pushed aside for whatever seems more pressing in the moment. And then number 4, for a lot of us, the flexibility of squeezing things in tends to seem more comfortable overall, right? Because let's be real, picking a specific time to do something can leave some of us feeling a lot of pressure because of what we're thinking, right? Because we're thinking to ourselves, oh my gosh, now it's planned and I have to stick to it no matter what. Or what am I going to do if something comes up and then I have to change and I never stick to my schedule? And our brains freak out. Some of our brains really rebel against the idea of making this kind of commitment. So instead, we soothe ourselves by saying, you know what? I'm just going to do it when I can. Or I'll circle back on choosing a date later once I know more about what's going on. And again, this can be effective in certain situations. Sometimes we do want to practice that flexibility. So I don't want an all or nothing statement here where we need to be one or the other. That's not the case. Sometimes we do want to be more flexible. However, many of us tend to rely on those go-to thoughts of, I'll wing it. I'll get to it when I can. And when that's our go-to thought, it does feel like relief in the moment. But when it's our go-to thought, it also can keep us stuck in that same cycle of never making time for the things we really want to prioritize. Okay? So what might this look like in real life? Okay? So one example that I was talking about with a client recently, he runs his own business and he wanted to start sending out a weekly newsletter. Okay. So he cares about this newsletter. He cares about his list. He wants to connect with the people on his list. He wants to do the work. Okay. It doesn't feel like a should for him. He wants to do it. But every week he found that he would tell himself, well, I just have kind of open pockets of time randomly between appointments. So I'm just going to fit it in when I have a moment. There's always those little down times. And I know I can find the time. I'll fit it in then. And again, as we've all experienced, these moments, they just never seem to present themselves at the quote unquote right time. And we can never seem to do the thing. And it wasn't until he started setting aside one dedicated block, for him it's on Monday mornings, where things finally shifted. And the best part, what I've heard from him, is that once he started creating that space, it actually felt easier to write because he wasn't trying to squeeze it in between appointments when all of that attention residue was kind of smearing because he's bouncing from one thing to the next. Instead, he could give his brain a clear time to focus. He had that container of space in which to work, in which to create. For myself, this pattern showed up a lot with reading, which I know I've mentioned a few times recently because this is my good, better, best goal for the first quarter. So I love reading, but for the longest time, I kept assuming that I would just find the time for it. I'll read before bed, or you know what? I'm just going to spend all Saturday reading away. Or, if I have an open pocket between appointments or whatever. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to read. Now, what actually happened, I would get to the end of the day, I'd be tired, and I hadn't read a single page. Okay. And it wasn't until I finally set that good, better, best goal of 5 minutes, 15 minutes, or 30 minutes of reading, and then pairing that with a specific time when I'm going to bed. That is when I actually started making time for reading, the thing I've been wanting to do. And again, there's some net positive benefits that I wasn't even anticipating, because as I've built up this habit, I've noticed that I find it even easier to go to bed because I now want the full 30 minutes to read. And again, the key here was intentionally identifying reading as a priority and then creating space for it, instead of relying on this false hope that I'd be able to, quote unquote, fit it in somewhere. Okay. So we've talked about why it makes sense that many of our ADHD brains do default to, I'm just going to fit it in, or I can squeeze it in, or I'll find the time at some point. But I also want to take a minute and look at the impact of those thoughts. Okay, what actually happens when we tend to rely solely on this approach? And again, this is not about judging ourselves. It's not about shaming ourselves. It's not about beating ourselves up. It's just about noticing the patterns and noticing if they happen quite frequently and whether or not you like the result of that. Again, for some of us, we're in a season of life where we do need to play a lot by ear, and that approach is super supportive. But for some of us in other seasons, it's become a habit and we might want to question it. And for myself, because I'm not in a season of a lot of unpredictability, it can be a habit that holds me back. And one of the areas where I notice it come up the most is with the kind of mental weight of the open loops or the unfinished plans. You know that feeling, right? It's that kind of subtle or not so subtle weight in the back of your mind or kind of on your shoulders, reminding you of all of those things you meant to do. So for myself, if I use that reading example, it was the book that would sit on my nightstand, never opened. Or maybe it's the workout you wanted to fit in, or the self-care routine that you wanted to practice, and you keep kind of remembering it, but there's not the time for it, or it's never the right time. And it's so exhausting to carry that open loop around all the time. And even if we don't consciously think about it all the time throughout the day, it still takes up space in our minds. It's like these extra books that we're carrying in our backpack that we don't actually need for the day, right? And every time we remember them, we get that familiar pang of, oh gosh, I still haven't done that. I'm still carrying this thing around. And honestly, that mental weight is, for me at least, often heavier than doing the thing itself, especially because for myself, a lot of the things are things I want to do. So that's number one of the areas where it seems to leave a net negative impact. That open loop, that heaviness of kind of carrying around the thing that I didn't get to, that I keep telling myself this is important. The second thing that I noticed come up for myself is this sense of frustration of, where did the time go? That kind of end of the day realization, that moment when we sit down, we look at the clock and we're like, what even happened to the day? I was going to do all of these things. I really wanted to make time for this. I had the best of intentions. I wanted to do the thing. I thought I would have time. But then somehow the day fills up with everything except what I really cared about doing, because I told myself I'm going to squeeze it in. And when that keeps happening day after day, it's very easy to start feeling quite frustrated. I know for myself, I will start questioning, why can't I just make this work? I'm so sick of constantly playing catch up. Why can't I just figure this out? And I start getting pretty hard on myself. Another obstacle that I notice is this feeling of disconnection from these areas that really bring us joy. And honestly, this is one of the hardest ones for myself. When I don't intentionally create the space for the things that light me up, I slowly start to feel that disconnect from them. So this could be a work project that falls into the important but not urgent category. Okay, those key things that we want to do, but we can never seem to find the time because we're always answering emails and putting out fires. Or perhaps more commonly in this category, again, for myself at least, it's the hobbies, the creative outlets, the relationships, rest, downtime. These are often the first things to get sacrificed when we assume we're going to find the time. I'm going to squeeze it in. I know there will be time. And sure, we might find some form of, let's say, resting here and there. We might scroll our phones or collapse on the couch at the end of the day. But when we're quote unquote resting in that way, it's often more of a reactive thing. We crash on the couch at the end of the night, or we scroll our phone between meetings to kind of check out because that's what we can easily fit in the cracks. And we don't really have capacity to make a decision of what you'd want to do in the downtime otherwise. But when we intentionally set aside that time for these important activities, we start truly enjoying them and experiencing the benefits of them rather than just making them another checklist item that we think we have to do to check off the list. This is what often happens with our self-care routines and the things we genuinely want to do in our lives. We start making them these checklist activities that we have to just squeeze in no matter what, and you're going to find the time, and it doesn't matter if it's super late or whatever, but you don't actually get the enjoyment because you don't have the proper amount of time, or it's not happening at the optimal time for you to really enjoy the experience. Okay, so what can we do here? If you're hearing this, if you're recognizing, you know what? There might be a couple of areas where I do want to try intentionally planning my day a bit more. There's maybe one or two activities where I do tell myself, oh, I'll do that later. I'll make sure to do that at some point today. And then it slips, right? If you have those areas where you want to start intentionally creating some plans without dropping into fantasy plan of time blocking every moment of perfection, what can we do? This is actually where I think the strategy of planning in quarters or planning in fifths can be really impactful. So instead of relying on the hope that we're going to find time, quote unquote, later, we build it into our days more intentionally. And we do that by giving it a designated space in one of the fifths throughout the day. Right? We're not overscheduling. We're not feeling super rigid about it. So for the brains who need a little bit more breathing room, the planning in quarters and fifths can be super supportive. Now, I will say as well, I am a brain who needs a lot of structure. I often talk about how we all have different levels of structure. Some of us need really tight time blocking. Some of us need much looser scheduling. This is something I work on right away at the beginning of my work with clients because it's such a key component. And for those of us who do need a higher level of structure, you might want to use the traditional method of time blocking here, where you block in for an hour at lunch reading your book or calling up a friend when you're walking the dog or whatever, right? You might want to intentionally schedule those things with more specific times. But for a lot of us ADHDers, we want a looser level of structure, and that is where the planning in quarters and fifths can be such a gift to ourselves because it gives us a general time without getting locked into something specific, but also you have that general time so it doesn't get lost. Now, if you haven't heard me talk about this concept of planning in quarters and fifths, I do recommend popping back to episode 243. So it's a little while back, but it's a much more in-depth exploration. I will give you a quick overview here, but if this is new to you, and you are a person who's looking for a scheduling approach that's not quite as strict as traditional time blocking, give it a listen, okay? Episode 243. But essentially, the idea here is instead of either seeing the day as one long stretch of time, right? Here's my whole day, gonna get stuff done in it from this long to-do list, or dividing it into super small 30 or 60-minute blocks, like those of us with higher level structure prefer. What we do with planning in quarters and fifths is that we divide our day into either 4 or 5 natural sections. So if we're thinking in quarters, this might be morning, midday, afternoon, and evening. If we're thinking in fifths, this might look like early morning, mid-morning, afternoon, late afternoon, and evening. Now for myself, if I don't have a lot going on, I do like the fifths approach. And I tend to think about it according to time. So I will think of my fifths as 6 to 9 a.m., 9 to 12, 12 to 3, 3 to 6, 6 to 9. Okay. So that is a strategy that works for me when I am craving a little bit of a looser level of structure, right? 6 to 9, 9 to 12, 12 to 3, 3 to 6, 6 to 9. Now, of course, you can shift your hours however you want to, but that's what works for me. And this helps me to see my time more clearly and to reset throughout the day. So if things don't go as planned from my 6 to 9, let's say I oversleep or something, I can reset. It's okay. It's a fresh start at the 9 a.m. mark, right? And it allows us to build that looser level of structure without trying to control every minute of the day. So again, this is also really useful for people who do have a little bit more unpredictability in their schedule because you're creating a bit more flexibility. You have an open schedule with these 5 different blocks, and you can move things around as needed. So how do we use the planning in quarters or fifths to help us shift from squeezing things in to intentionally making space? Well, instead of hoping that you're going to make time to read at some point or make time to work on that dress you're sewing or to do that deep work project, create that slide deck, rest for some downtime because you've been in your thoroughbred mode running hard and you need that rest. Instead of just hoping that you'll find the time, you want to give those activities a home in your day. Write them in one of your 4 or 5 blocks. Now, you don't have to do that task for the entire quarter or fifth, okay? But give it a spot in your day so your brain knows generally when you want to be doing that thing at some point between the 9 to 12 block or whatever. Now, again, I'm not saying that you need to do the thing for the whole 3 hours. If I put reading from 6 to 9, that doesn't mean I'm going to read from 6 to 9. It means I'm going to read in my evening block at some point in there. Okay, so it's kind of that middle ground for those of us who are looking for a little bit of flexibility, but also some bookends to help hold us up. Or let's say you want to prioritize writing your newsletter. Instead of telling yourself, well, I'm going to do this when I have time, you might instead decide, I tend to be pretty clear mid-morning. So that's maybe the best time. Mid-morning is when I write my newsletter. And then you can get more specific if you want, like my client did on Mondays. Monday mid-morning is when I do my newsletter or whatever. Okay. So it's not about being overly strict. It's about making sure that the activities you want to have happen have a reserved space in your day. And whether that means just a quarter or a fifth, you put it somewhere in one of those quarters or fifths. Or again, if you're a higher level of structure like I am, where you want more structure, you might put it in specifically at 10:30. Whatever works for you is amazing. But making that intentional decision of this is when I want to do it is such a gift to your brain. In fact, one of the biggest shifts here is moving from that I'll do it when I can to this is when I'll do it. It's that decision point. And that shift is everything because it takes the guesswork out of the moment. You don't have to rely on your willpower or hope or your working memory that you can fit it all in because you've already made the decision. I'm going to work on this proposal in my afternoon block, my first afternoon block. You've already decided. Okay? And here's the key. There is that flexibility here, right? It doesn't have to be perfect. You can absolutely move your blocks around if needed. If you were going to work on that slide deck from the 12 to 3 slot, but your boss comes in and needs to talk to you, okay, maybe you swap it with the 3 to 6 block and you do that before you head home from work or whatever, okay? You absolutely have the space to flip things around, to move things around. The key is just making sure that you have those items in a specific place on your calendar so that you can actually prioritize the areas that you want to tend to this season. Now, another thing I want to mention is to use this strategy to also help you honor your energy. when you use this quarter or fifths method, it's so much easier to honor those energy levels and honor your capacity. When we are trying to simply squeeze things in, but we're also constantly fighting fires and trying to help everyone else and do all the things without tending to the things we want to do, we usually, if we do manage to squeeze it in, don't fit it at the time that actually works best for us. I'm going to give you an example here. In fact, this is the client who really inspired this episode. She shared how she had on her running to-do list that she wanted to work out or move every day. Okay. And so she made that commitment. She wanted to make sure it happened. And she kept trying to quote unquote fit it in throughout the day. But because she didn't have that set specific block, she repeatedly found herself trying to cram it in at 11:30 at night because she told herself she would, but she never found the time anywhere else in the day because, as we ADHDers tend to do, we find other things that seem to be so important in the moment because it's now or not now. And she's not a night owl. So working out at 11:30 p.m. meant that she had nothing left in the tank at that time of day. And then it also threw off her sleep quality. And that strategy just wasn't working for her. Fitting it in was not effective for her. So instead of forcing herself into this schedule that didn't match her reality, she first paused and thought to herself, okay, this isn't working. What do I want to try instead? What is a block that would be more supportive for me? What would work better for my energy levels? What would feel really supportive? And then she shifted the times so that she could put in her schedule working out at a time that honored her energy levels. So when you are planning your 1 to 3 priorities throughout the day, I encourage you to ask yourself, when do I naturally have energy for this? When does it feel easiest? Because if we try to push through at a time that just doesn't work well for our brain or our body, honestly, we're really setting ourselves up for frustration. And of course, there are times when we just don't have the luxury of choice, and that's the time it is, and we make it work. Okay. But if we have the choice, if we have the space to play with it, give yourself that gift. All right, let's bring this all together. So as a reminder, what we're talking about today, it's not about cramming our schedules full of things or forcing ourselves into rigid time blocks, okay? It's not about that. It's not about scheduling every second of the day or turning life into a never-ending to-do list, okay? We're not doing that here. That is not sustainable. That is not enjoyable. What we're doing here today is starting to notice when we're constantly trying to quote unquote fit things in and deciding instead to bring some intention to these 1 or 2 areas so that we're creating space for what we want to prioritize. Because when we stop hoping that time will work out and we'll be able to squeeze it in, and we instead start intentionally making that space, that's when everything shifts. And again, the best part here is that it does not have to be a massive overhaul. Those small changes, like choosing 1 block for your writing or setting aside time in the evening for true rest, or deciding that on Wednesday evenings, you make time for that hobby that you love. Making that one decision can make a huge impact for your schedule. So this week, I invite you to think about one area in your life that you are kind of trying to fit in. Maybe you want to read more often, like me, or maybe it's time with your friends, or maybe you want to work on that creative project you say you want to start, or maybe it's that long-term project for work that you've been meaning to get to, but just haven't had the time yet. Now ask yourself, what would happen if I planned space for this week? Where might it naturally fit? When would it feel easiest? What small adjustment could help make it happen? No pressure, no perfectionism, just curiosity. And then give it a try and let me know how it goes. Send me a message over on Instagram. I'm busy being awesome. I would love to hear about it. All right, my friends, that's going to do it for us this week. And if you are ready to take the concepts and apply them to your life, If you're ready to learn how to support your ADHD in a way that works best for you, I invite you to check out today's show notes where you can learn more about how we can work together both in my small group coaching program, We're Busy Being Awesome, as well as one-on-one coaching. Also, do you know of someone who would love to learn a little bit more about how to intentionally create space in their schedules for the things that matter most? Then be a rock star and share this episode with them. Snap a screenshot and share it on your Instagram stories or send it to them in a text message. Whatever you do, please know that I so appreciate you for helping me spread these strategies to even more busy, awesome brains who need them. Until next time, keep being awesome. I'll talk with you soon.